great pleasure to invite you to have this chance, and I will listen carefully your presentation. And it's time also for my colleague to talk to you, because he wants to be sure that everything works.
Yeah. Okay, Richard, hello. Good morning from Prague. It's not exactly morning in Sydney, is it?
Good evening. It's 7:15 at night.
Okay.
But it is still daylight because it is nearly summer here.
Okay. So just double check if everything is okay. Do you hear us loud and clearly?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. So if it's okay, we are glad to have you here and you can start.
Thank you very much. You can see I've got a KlasifiKon badge, but it says 2019 because my good friend Miroslav gave me this in 2019. It is a great privilege to be invited to speak at the KlasifiKon conference, and it is very important for the development of classifications that countries like the Czech Republic are enthusiastic not only to learn about these classifications, but also have very forward-looking plans to implement and use them. So it's a great pleasure to be here today. Thank you. Now you're going to put my slides up. Is that the plan? Sorry, are my slides going to be on the screen? I've lost connection. Hello? Ah, I see a slide. Are you sharing the screen?
Yeah. Okay. Everything is okay?
Yeah, I'm not seeing the screen. All I'm seeing is me. I'm not seeing the screen.
Okay, but I think we see the screen. We see you and we see the screen. So
I'm sorry. I've had the wrong setting on.
Okay.
Okay. I'll get my own version up, I think. Just one moment, please. So the presentation I'm giving today is authored by myself, Megan Kumalato and Nicole Rankin. Megan and Nicole are the WHO Secretariat now working on ITCHI, but have been working on ITCHI for many years, Megan since 2008. And I thank them very much for their efforts. So the next slide, please. The outline of what I'm speaking about today is very quickly to introduce the WHO reference classifications and speak briefly about their development, talk about the background to the development of ITCHI, its scope and its use cases, then the structure of ITCHI and content of ITCHI, to give some examples of the use of ITCHI, then briefly touch on using the three classifications together, the ICD, the ICF and ITCHI, then say a little bit about testing, education and maintenance, and the timetable that's planned for the finalisation of ITCHI. So the next slide, please. So this is the family of classifications in the WHO's network of international classifications. ICD-11, now the classification of diseases, replacing ICD-10 over the coming years. The ICF, the International Classification of Functioning Disability in Health, and ITCHI. The next slide, please. The ICD has, of course, been around since the 1890s and is now in its 11th edition. It was originally developed to classify causes of death, but is now used, at least as importantly, to classify the diagnoses of the living, morbidity conditions. The International Classification of Functioning Disability and Health was approved by the World Health Assembly in 2001. It is based on a biopsychosocial model of functioning disability and is a multi-axial classification of body functions and structures, activities and participation, and environmental factors. So very different in structure to ICD. And then there's ICHI. The WHO developed an international classification of procedures in medicine in 1978, but this was not maintained and mainly just covered surgical interventions. Ultimately, it was decided not to maintain it anymore. The result was that many countries then went off and developed their own classifications, including Australia. And of course, every country did it in a different way. So you ended up with completely disparate structures and everyone doing the same work a little bit differently, but huge duplication of effort. And so now we're working on ICHI for completion in 2022. But at the moment, and for many years now, interventions are the missing link for WHO. So the next slide, and then the next slide, please. So the ICHI journey began in 2007 after a decision at the HUFIC network meeting in 2006 that it was time to start filling this gap. What we found back in 2007 was this proliferation of national classifications that I've just mentioned, but many countries without any classification at all. If you couldn't afford to develop one, all you could do was use the US one, which was the only one available in the public domain, but many countries had nothing. International comparisons were very difficult given all those different comparisons, and there had been an effort in the early 2000s to do that by the OECD and Eurostat, but it proved a very difficult exercise and took 3 years to find 36 interventions where there could be a comparison. And so the ICHI development commenced. So after 14 years, we have ICHI planned for completion in 2022. The WHO platform is now in place. That's a new development in the last 12 months. For the last 5 or 6 years, we've had an excellent platform developed at the University of Udine in Italy by colleagues in the Italian network. But now the WHO has its own platform, which is integrated with the ICD-11 platform and now the ICF platform. The WHO has done an international review of the medical and surgical content in ICHI in 2020, and that content is now stable in the classification. A similar review of functioning interventions is now underway. You'll be hearing more about functioning interventions from Anne-Helene Armberg very shortly. And excitingly, we've had a major development of work to classify public health interventions. The next slide, please. The use cases for ICHI are, first of all, the national use cases, the countries with no classification, the countries who have used that US classification, ICD-9-CM Volume 3, which is now replaced in America by a new classification. So that classification that many countries have used is essentially now a legacy classification. There are countries that wish to align their national classifications with ICHI, and there's been quite a lot of mapping work going on in various countries to see how feasible that is. And then there are other countries that have talked about adding sections of ICHI to their own classification where they don't currently have any content. And that particularly refers to functioning interventions. The second set of use cases is international comparisons, which is very highly desired by many agencies as well, including the OECD and Eurostat. There's the use of ICHI interventions to describe what can be done in seeking to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals. There's a similar charting of interventions that can be used to achieve universal health coverage. There's the use of interventions in patient safety and quality work to describe the interventions that can go wrong and lead to safety and quality problems, and then also the interventions that are done in response to those errors, both in the individual case and in the more systemic case. Then there's the use of interventions in health system performance, and notably, of course, in case mix systems for health financing systems. And then there's the public health use cases that I won't say anything more about today, but include the coding of interventions, planning of interventions, and communication among public health providers. So the next slide, please. ICHI, given all those use cases, ICHI from the very beginning has been developed with a very broad scope, covering not only acute care and mental health, which I suppose are the scope of the national classifications that have been developed, but ICHI also covers primary care, allied health, assistance with functioning, rehabilitation, prevention, public health, and traditional medicine. So it covers the whole of the health system. Next slide, please. The definition of a health intervention that has been developed as the basis for ICHI is that a health intervention is an act performed for, with, or on behalf of a person or a population whose purpose is to improve, assess, maintain, promote, or modify health functioning or health conditions. Next slide, please. ICHI has 3 axes, so it is multi-axial. The first of those axes is the target of the intervention, which is the entity on which the action is carried out. The second axis is the action, that is the deed done by an actor to the target. And the third axis is the means, the processes and methods by which the action is carried out. So the next slide, please. Here are some examples of interventions in ICHI. I hope you can see this slide. The first example is a laparoscopic appendicectomy or appendectomy, if you're American, where the target is the appendix, KBO. The action is the excision, the total excision of the appendix of the target, JK, and the means is percutaneous endoscopic, AB. I won't try and describe the second one. The third one is a functioning intervention, the assessment of joint mobility. The target is mobility of joint functions. The action is assessment, and the means are not specified. The final example is a public health intervention, the enactment of restrictions through laws or standards to improve outdoor air quality. And here the target, UBM, is outdoor air quality. The action is restrictions through laws or standards, and the means is enactment of those laws or standards. And you can see that the targets are then combined into the ICHI STEM code, which is shown over on the left-hand side of the table. Now, the next slide, please. as well as those STEM codes that we developed in the early years of the development of ITCHI, as ICD-11 development was going along, the development of extension codes happened to enable more detail to be added in ICD-11 to diagnoses. And we've adapted that to use in ITCHI as well, to enable far more information to be added to STEM codes in ITCHI if the user wishes to use it. You don't have to use these, but they're available if you wish to. And the three at the top, therapeutic products, assistive products, and medicaments, are very important. Therapeutic products are largely implanted devices, implanted during interventions. Assistive products are products external to the body, which are used particularly in functioning interventions to provide support to people in various ways. And medicaments are drugs. And that STEM code, that extension code is exactly the same one as is being used in ICD-11, which is a good example of how these classifications are being developed together and using information over and over as far as is possible. I won't go through the list of all the other extension codes, but I re-emphasize these are voluntary, but they can also be extended as we need to, as the need for more detail emerges from ITCHI users. So now the next slide, please. We've also developed methods to combine ITCHI codes. And I'll just go through these quickly. The first one is the AND sign, the ampersand in English, which is used to link a STEM code, an ITCHI STEM code, and an extension code. So you can describe the intervention with the STEM code, the fairly general, possibly general code, and then give more detail using the extension codes in a string with the relevant STEM code. If interventions are performed together, you can put both interventions, code both interventions, and link them with a slash sign. If you've got packages of interventions, packages would be fairly common in mental health, in rehabilitation, and in public health. You can list the interventions one after the other and show they're in a package by using the plus sign. And the final method for linking is the hash sign, which is used when a code from another classification is used as part of ITCHI. This is a unique application in ITCHI. It's not used in the other classifications, but it's been very useful in coding public health interventions by linking ITCHI codes to the International Standard Industrial Classification, the UN Classification of Industry, and the Central Product Classification, also a UN classification. So you don't have to bring all that detail from other sectors of the economy and society into ITCHI itself. You can simply link to other international classifications. So all those methods have enabled us to use ITCHI very flexibly. The next slide, please. Now, inevitably, when we set out to give ITCHI this very broad scope, we had to decide what ITCHI would not do. And the first thing we decided right at the very beginning was that ITCHI would not give the reason for the intervention. Many national classifications mix reasons for interventions in their national classification. We have deliberately tried not to do that. And if you want to give the reason for the intervention, which of course you will, then we say you should use the ICD or the ICF. We don't describe the provider of the intervention, whether it's a surgeon or a nurse or a physiotherapist or a traditional medicine provider. We are not trying to do that. And of course, there are classifications of providers through the International Classification of Occupations developed by the ILO, if you wish to do that. We're not describing the setting of the intervention, whether it's done in a hospital or an ambulatory setting or in the back of an ambulance. We're not doing that. We are not including a measure of workload, so we're not trying to be a fee schedule, and we are not trying to describe the outcome of the intervention. Again, we propose that the user goes back to the ICD or the ICF to do that. Okay, the next slide. So where have we got to in 2021, 14 years on? Well, I repeat here the link to the Itchy browser that's on the WHO website now. It's up to date, I should say, for all the axes are up to date. Megan and Nicole have worked very hard to make sure that's true. But some of the STEM codes that result from material we've added to the axes in the last year or so, some of the STEM codes are not yet there, are not yet present. This mainly affects public health. It doesn't affect medical and surgical or functioning interventions. But that's work in progress, and it'll be done very soon. Today, we have over 7,000 STEM codes in Itchy, and each of those has inclusions, exclusions, index terms, the normal descriptive material you would expect. The axes are all there, the extension codes are all there, and there is a reference guide available on the browser. It's unfortunately quite hard to find. If you go to the Itchy link on the browser and then you go to the info tab, you will find the Itchy browser. The Itchy reference guide, and that will describe in detail the structure of Itchy that I've just gone through and give you advice on how to use Itchy. So I've already said that's a common platform with ICD-11 and ICF, and a coding tool is still under development. There is already one for ICD-11. It will look very similar to that, but we'll make it easier to code from day to day. Okay, the next slide, please. 16. So Itchy now has 28 chapters. The first 12 contain the medical and surgical interventions, but also interventions on body functions using the ICF body functions axis as targets. There are 9 chapters describing interventions on activities and participation domains from the ICF, and we've actually used the ICF codes as targets. Then there's 6 chapters with interventions on the environment. The first 5 of those are using the environmental factors of the ICF. The last chapter is a new chapter, which is a selection of commonly used targets from industries and products for use with public health. And the last chapter, importantly, is interventions on health-related behaviours, lifestyle behaviours, safety behaviours, violence-related behaviours, and so on. Okay, the next slide is an example of how to use ICD, ICF, and Itchy together. The first example is fairly simple. You've got a disease, Crohn's disease, described using an ICD-11 code, and you've got an intervention that's used in response to that condition. The second example is rather more complicated and rather hard to see, I'm afraid. But the first use of Itchy is using diagnostic interventions on a patient who has just appeared in the health system. So itchy contains a number of diagnostic interventions, and you can code the diagnostic interventions undertaken on the patient using itchy. That will give you a series of functioning problems of the patient, or symptoms, if you like, which you can code using the ICF. And out of all of that information, hopefully a diagnosis or diagnoses will be developed, which you describe in ICD-11. And then that leads to a treatment plan, which you can describe using itchy with the therapeutic and functioning interventions in itchy. So you get the whole spectrum of care of the patient from beginning to end using those three classifications together. The next slide, please. Work is now starting on developing a WHO grouper. It's been a common request that how do we do case mix applications if we use ICD-11 and itchy for coding diseases and coding interventions. Many countries have used American groupers or the Australian grouper using ICD-10 or national modification of ICD-10, it would be ICD-10-CM or ICD-10-AM, and have used the national classifications in the US or Australia because there is a grouper available to go with them. So there's been a recognition by the WHO and the HUFIC network that we really need a grouper to complete the package that users will require. Of course, the WHO has been very busy with ICD-11 development and itchy development, so this is only starting now. One of the interesting features of the groupers that exist across the world is how similar many of them are, because they've come from a common base in the US in the 1970s and 80s. So the US groupers, the Australian groupers, and the Nordic groupers are very, very similar. The Nordic grouper has the advantage of being in the public domain and also is very common to people very active in the HUFIC network. So the WHO thinking now is to, subject to agreement from the Nordic countries, which I think is expected, the Nordic grouper will be used as the basis for developing a WHO grouper. Personally, I don't think that is all that difficult to do. No doubt problems will emerge, but the aim is to provide this package of ICD-11, itchy, and a grouper to user countries. The next slide, please. So after all this time, how can we complete itchy? Well, I've mentioned the international reviews that are underway. We plan to finalise the content, the reference guide and education material in light of those reviews, get that itchy coding tool completed, and then move through the formal approval process. And then once itchy is formally approved, maintenance and updates will be the same, use the same processes as ICD and ICF. Next slide, please. This is actually a slide shown to us by WHO at our annual meeting about 3 weeks ago by Robert Jacob from the WHO, which is there.
Sorry, Richard. I'm sorry, do you hear us? Because we don't hear you. Richard? Okay. Sorry, but...
In March 2022. April 2022, the WHO proposes to begin consultation with member states, which is a formal process of writing to ministers for health in each member state. And get comments back over the following 3 months. That will lead to some final edits in August 2022. And then that's a phone in my house, just a moment. Sorry. Implementation preparation will then, the formal processes will then commence in August 2022, leading up to the meeting of the Executive Board of WHO in December 2022 and presumably through to the World Health Assembly in 2023. So that's the timetable in the WHO's own words. So the next slide, please, is just a conclusion to say after 14 years, many wrinkles on my face, I'm afraid, because of this, but after 14 years, itchy is now a reality. We envisage completion, practical completion next year. And I want to express my thanks to the many developers across the HUFIC network, including in the Czech Republic, of course, through Miroslav and his colleagues, but right across every region of the WHO, over the 14 years, far too many people to name, but it really has been a cooperative effort and bringing everyone's knowledge and energy to bear to produce the outcome we've got to. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Okay, Richard, thank you very much for your presentation. And I do believe we really have questions. So please, Ms. Petráková, can you...
Yes, also many thanks from my side, Richard, for very interesting and important news. And I'm looking forward if we have any questions from connected audience. But before reading some of them, I have one question to you. As I mentioned, I was spending some years with WHO in Geneva with evidence information and for policy cluster at the time led by Chris Murray and then by Tim Evans. And I was thinking, and you had it on your slides, relation and possibilities for future between ICD, upcoming ICD 11 and ICHI.
Yeah, well, yes. ICD-11 has been developed with a foundation, and the foundation contains vast amounts of detail about health conditions. And I'm not an expert at all in the detail of this, but there are plans to further develop that with genetics and other advanced information being included in it. So really the foundation will become a terminology for health, which is a really exciting development. And then what you do is you linearize from that very detailed foundation, you linearize to the particular application you want. So if you're coding cause of death, you want something that looks like the ICD we're all familiar with. If you're coding in hospitals, you want something that looks like a morbidity classification. But behind it is this very detailed structure, and you can use it for any particular purpose you want. Now, how itchy is only one structure at the moment, but it's got all these extension codes, and it'll be very interesting to see how that develops and how these different national approaches that have developed over the last 30 years or so, how they unify once itchy is there. And it's conceivable that you will get something akin to ICD-11. Countries have used ICD and nationally modified it, but they've all had to use a common core of ICD. Itchy will provide that common core for interventions, and the ICF provides it for functioning now. So I think you'll see a much, much stronger approach through these systems in really forming an integrated terminology for the whole of the health sector.
Very much for important answer.
Okay.
And I have Miroslav.
It's also a brave answer.
Join me for discussion, so we are both here.
So please, Richard, stay with us for a while.
We have questions, Richard, still.
Ano, dámy a pánové, k nám se v tuto chvíli připojila taky dobrá duše KlasifiKonu a rychlá spojka mezi vámi a námi, to znamená muž, který nám taky přinese dotazy, pan doktor Miroslav Zvolský. Dobré dopoledne, pane doktore.
Dobré dopoledne vám všem. Já bych se chtěl trochu omluvit za některé technické problémy, které nás trochu doprovázejí, jakože mě chvilkama můžete třeba předývaně slyšet z překladatelské kabinky. A to je opravdu velmi předývané a navíc to, obávám se, způsobuje víc problémů než užitku, protože někteří si přepli tu angličtinu, kterou očekávali překládanou a tam nebylo vůbec nic. Takže někteří z vás, kteří měli problémy se zvukem, obracíte se na mě, můžu na to pravděpodobně já. Tak, ale vraťme se zpátky teda k dotazům na Richarda. Jeden se objevil v chatu a sice a teď nevím, jestli mám povídat anglicky nebo česky, protože mě teďka nikdo nepřeloží, když nejsem v té kabince vzadu, v zákulisí. Richard, we have a question in the chat, and the question is if you can advise or direct us to some literature, some articles that are published about itchy in general. I can maybe suggest to communicate this with you via email, for example, and we can enter this into the chat as an answer. But if you can say something about publications about itchy.
Yeah, it's a problem, Miroslav. There has been an effort 5 or 6 years ago to publish a fundamental paper describing the development of itchy, as there has been an effort to describe the development of ICD-11 in a base paper, but it hasn't happened, and itchy hasn't either. So I won't go into the reasons for that, but the way the WHO network works is through its own communication systems. And the academic literature really hasn't been heavily used. There have been some papers, sectional papers, if you like, on some applications of itchy, largely written by people who are interested in the particular field they're writing about. And they describe itchy in passing. So I can give you a list of papers, as you say, offline, but there isn't a fundamental paper to read. By far the best document is that reference guide I referred to, which is available on the WHO website. And I'll send you, if you like, and it's on that slide I had about how to find it, but it's not that easy to find. So it is a bit of a problem, I think, the description at the moment. And of course, the WHO has gone through various phases of enthusiasm about itchy. And from time to, you've already heard mention of Bedahan Houston. There were times when Bedahan had very few resources and really thought this couldn't be done. So they didn't want to get too far ahead of themselves. So it's not as well documented as it should be.
Maybe I will switch into Czech again for colleagues that are more comfortable with Czech language. Tak trošku přepneme do češtiny, jenom komentuji s dovolením ten původní dotaz, který poslal kolega z Polska, a sice ptal se na to, jakým způsobem se může dostat k literatuře, k publikacím o itchy, a pan profesor Madden to komentoval tak, že vlastně to gro informací je prostřednictvím právě spolupracující sítě center WHO a nikoliv tedy v běžném akademickém tisku a v akademických žurnálech, a že vlastně jsou publikovány spíš jaksi částečné informace o specifickém použití itchy a ty lze prostřednictvím tedy vyhledávačů v literatuře dohledat. Takže ale pan profesor uznává, že to je jistým způsobem téma a jistým způsobem problém víc přístupnit informace o itchy, a odkazoval ještě na referenční příručku k itchy, která bude publikována.
Vážení účastníci konference, možná je to i pro vás ještě taková poslední výzva. Pokud máte na pana Maddena nějaký dotaz, tak ho co možná nejrychleji položte do komentářů přímo v Zoomu. Potom bude ta příležitost je ještě rychle položit. Ale předpokládám, že nějaké dotazy ještě máme. I believe we have more questions for you, Richard.
Waiting for the audience to answer questions, I have one, in fact, simple, I hope, simple question to you, practical one. Because as we know from ICD, there is a timeline, how often to upgrade the classification. For ICHI, do you have already proposal how often, what will be the time cycle of ICHI for additional updates, etc.? Some more practicalities?
Well, that's a very good question. There's now a standard updating process for ICD and ICF adopted within the WHOFIC network, which works through an annual cycle. Anyone can make a proposal on the WHO platform for an update, and that proposal is considered. And if scientific advice is needed, that advice is sought. And then towards the annual meeting, there's a systematic review of those proposals, and they're finally voted on at the annual meeting. The plan is that ICHI will go through exactly the same process. There'll be that continuing update process. Hopefully that will avoid the need for a major revision of ICHI for many years. ICD-10 was updated the first time ICD had been updated, and that allowed the period between revisions to extend out to 30 years. So, you know, it's been a very good process, and it's become more systematized. And of course, the technology has improved dramatically to allow this sort of work to happen now efficiently offline during the year.
Thank you very much, Richard, and I will briefly translate it into the Czech language for colleagues listening in the Czech language. So, já jsem se ptala pana profesora, jakým způsobem bude prováděn update této ICHI klasifikace. Zda to bude tak, jak se updateuje ICD a další klasifikace, jednou za rok doporučení na webovou stránku WHO, a jeho odpověď je ano, půjdeme stejným procesem, tak, nebo plánujeme tedy stejný proces, tak jako je například ICD, mezinárodní klasifikace nemocí, updateovaná.
Tak,
Richard, we are
rovnou otázka na pana doktora Zvolského. Jestli pak nám přišel s nějakým dotazem?
Já jsem odběhl do chatu, do četny.
Do četny, ano.
Do četny, vedle šatny. Takže v chatu se zatím další otázka neobjevila, nicméně pokud to již neproběhlo, já jsem chtěl, protože jsme se s paní docentkou Petrákou domluvali, že se na to zeptáme, a zeptáme se pana profesora, které státy jsou vlastně nejdál v pilotování použití ICHI v současné době. Which countries are more or the most advanced in piloting ICHI just nowadays, from your perspective, Richard?
In developing or trying to use?
Yes.
Both. I think both, developing and piloting implementation.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a bit of a paradox. You see, the countries that have developed their national classifications are in many cases very, very attached to them. And Australia would be one of those. So I think in Australia, there's no progress toward even thinking about the implementation of ICHI. Even though our own classification has problems, it's running out of room in some cases because of its structure. I think similarly, the US it's developed its ICD-10 PCS, and who knows when they'll do it? You know, who knows when they'll adopt the metric system in the US? So that's very difficult. On the other hand, countries like Canada who've got a very complicated classification, but which is broadly structured like itchy, I think are very interested. The UK has the United Kingdom has a very old classification they've been unhappy with for many years, and they're certainly doing mapping work to itchy. So there are some who are very interested, but how quickly the Europeans will do it, I don't know. On the other hand, the Asian countries, I think, are much more likely to adapt ICD-11 and probably itchy or an itchy-like classification. China has been very interested in the development of itchy and has provided a lot of assistance in the development of itchy over the years. Korea has been very interested. So I think the actual first implementations could well be in Asia. And now there's been some initial use in Egypt and in Africa. One of the reviewers came from Rwanda, and I think they're very interested there. I know South Africa is actively looking for a classification. I've been able to present itchy in South Africa in the past. So I think there'll be implementation. I'm talking only about the medical and surgical part. I think there'll be implementation probably away from Europe and away from the US, away from Australia, before there is in those countries. I've mentioned Canada is probably a standout exception, maybe the UK. And of course, I hope the Czech Republic.
Okay, thank you, Richard. And we have a new question from chat. Miroslav?
No, to se dostáváme hezky do té mnohojazyčnosti. Já mám dojem, že kolega z AV Medie se pokouší překládat do druhého jazyka.
Tak trochu mu to zkomplikujeme.
Trochu mu to zkomplikujeme, ano. Tak máme dotaz v chatu, jaké jsou výhody a nevýhody nahrazení MKN10 Clinical Modification prostřednictvím té nové klasifikace ICHI. A možná bychom to mohli zobecnit, jaké jsou obecně výhody a nevýhody přechodu na novou klasifikaci. A já to teďka zkusím formulovat pro Richarda. Richard, I'm sorry for switching between languages, and now I've read the question from chat, and I'll try to send you forward it to you. What are pros and cons of switching or replacing ICD-10-CM with ICHI? And maybe to generalize this question a little bit, what are pros and cons of switching or replacing some existing classification that is in use with ICHI?
I think ICD-10-CM or ICD-9-CM?
ICD-10-CM.
Well, ICD-10-PCS is the new classification in the US. It contains, I think, something like 70,000 stem codes with a huge amount of pre-coordination in it. So it is very, very complicated. Now, I don't know how it's used in the US, but ICD-9-CM that preceded it had 5,000 stem codes. And ICHI content started out by using ICD-9-CM content. I said we've got over 7,000 now. ICD-9-CM had 5,000. So to map from 9-CM to ICHI is relatively easy. That map exists. 10-PCS, I don't think you'd be a very brave user to try to use 10-PCS. So that's the pro. The other pro is that 9-CM is now a legacy classification, so it's not being updated. So they're all pros, I suppose. I can't think of a con. I think ICHI is... The great thing about ICHI is it's scalable. You can use it as a fairly compact classification with the 7,000 stem codes, or you can make it much more detailed using the extension codes. It's flexible. And if you start small, you can expand to the much more detailed way of going. If you use the US ones, you've either got the compact one, the old one, or you've got this huge one, the new one. You've got to take one or the other.
Tak, děkujeme za odpověď. Uděláme takovou nepsanou dohodu, že já budu mluvit česky a pan doktor Zvolský, protože má mnohem lepší angličtinu než já, tak případně bude doplňovat anglicky. Máme poslední 2 minuty, nevím, jestli už je to čas k rozloučení nebo na nějaký velmi rychlý, stručný dotaz.
Maybe if I should speak English, it's a great honor. But to comment, there are no cons of changing to ICHI, as you mentioned. Of course, there will be problems with implementation, a new classification system, so it could be a contra. Something not negative, but to have in mind that there will be some possible problems and some complications with changing one system into another. But it's natural to have such problems with having something new.
I think if I can just add, Miroslav, one point. The WHO has developed this, what do you call it, the ATI system, where you can link your own patient administration system to the WHO classification systems. And there was an example given in the meeting 3 weeks ago, an example given of how to, with one page of code, how to sort of use the WHO tools in your own patient administration system. So the technology they've developed is really fantastic. And I think will massively simplify the implementation of these classifications compared to previous changes.
Myslím si, že v tuto chvíli už zbývá jenom poděkovat panu Maddenovi za jeho čas. Okay, Richard, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for having the badge of KlasifiKon on your suit. Thank you.
Also, many thanks and greetings. Have a nice evening in Sydney.
Nice evening to Sydney.
Well, I'm going to listen to Anne Helene for a short time and then I'll disappear. Thank you very much.
Excellent.
Goodbye.